screen. So if you guys can monitor the chat and just interrupt me if anybody has questions or can't hear, that would be awesome. All right, great. Well, hi everyone, welcome back. I know it's been a couple of weeks, so thanks for joining us again early in the morning for many of you. Thank you also for chatting in your icebreaker question. Feel free to keep that going as we move through the slides today. I know that probably everyone is well aware of the webinar etiquette, but just to remind everybody where that mute button is and to keep yourself muted while there is discussion or other talking going on. So as you know, we've kind of have a broad group of instructors for this course, and we have different people coming in and out each week. So I just want to make sure everyone knows who's on the phone this session. This is Kristen Schmidt talking. You can maybe see my video in the corner depending on your display there. And then I'm going to be kind of tag teaming the lecture today with Patricia Leopold, whom some of you met 2 weeks ago, not last week. And then we've got Danielle Shannon on as well, who's going to be helping out with discussion today. So 3 of us joining. So what we really want to do today is go through a quick recap of step 3 for those of you who might have done it 2 weeks ago and are kind of racking your brain to remember what we did. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the assignment for the coming week and what it means to kind of select adaptation options and actions for your project. And I'll turn it over to Patricia at some point to introduce us to step 4 in the online adaptation workbook and the steps to go through that. Again, this is probably looking very familiar to most people. Just a recap of what we did for step 3. This step was really all about taking a really close look at your management goals and objectives after thinking about climate change and how it might impact your area or your property. And really thinking, okay, are these still the right goals and objectives? Am I still going to continue with these in spite of all the challenges that climate change might be introducing? And so as a part of that, we asked you to weigh some of the challenges that climate change might introduce to your management objectives and some of the potential opportunities that it might introduce, and think carefully about the feasibility of meeting those management objectives under climate change. So now that you've done the hard work and taken a close look at those objectives, this week is really what a couple of folks have described as the fun step. This is when we really get to think about, okay, what are those adaptation strategies and approaches and actions that will help us be more successful in meeting those management goals and objectives with the different challenges that climate change is introducing. And in this step, we use a tool that we call the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches, or menus. There are several of them, as I'll talk about here in just a second. So really a menu is exactly what it sounds like. It is a selection of possible adaptation actions that you can pick and choose from based on what makes sense for your project and what is relevant for your project location. And just to kind of dive into that a little bit more, each of the menus that we have, menus of strategies and approaches, is specific to a discipline or kind of a resource area. So as you noted when you signed into the adaptation workbook and you started your project, you kind of had to select a category, whether your project kind of fell more in the forestry realm or urban forests or forested watersheds. And those categories align with some of our adaptation strategies and approaches menus. And, this is similar to a menu in the fact that, if you go to an Italian restaurant or you go to a Mexican restaurant, you're going to expect to see a certain theme of food, a certain type of food on the menu, right? And so each one of our menus kind of has some of that more discipline specific terminology and some of those ideas within that category. Another feature of the menus is that they're organized hierarchically. So as you look through them, you'll kind of see these broad strategies that are really broader ideas, adaptation ideas, and then more specific approaches within those, which kind of narrow down a little bit on the specifics, getting a little bit closer to something that you can pin down as being appropriate for particular project areas. And then within that, you'll be designing tactics, which are the specific actions that you're going to implement on the ground. And each one of our menus has a couple of example tactics in there, although you're encouraged to go beyond those. And then finally, menus are meant to hopefully include a whole range of ideas that you might consider in a particular discipline. So these ideas might actually be opposing one another. This is not meant to be a checklist. Some of these ideas, will be in conflict depending on the area that you're implementing it. And so it really is meant to be something to pick and choose from, and not to take as a full comprehensive list. We really like the adaptation menus and using them in developing actions for a variety of reasons. And one of the main reasons is that it really helps to connect to kind of the broader overall intent of your adaptation to a specific action that you're doing on the ground. So instead of kind of, saying, okay, well, we're planting oak species here, and that makes sense for climate change, you can kind of go through that full train of thought to think about, we're planting oak species here because we're intentionally trying to change this forest type into something more climate adapted. And that's the broader intent behind our adaptation. So kind of covering numbers 1 and 2 on this list, it lets you connect the broad to specific and really make your actions intentional and describe, okay, here's what I'm trying to do by taking this action on the landscape. Kind of parallel with that is number 3 listed here. So it really helps you communicate that to a wider group of stakeholders or decision makers or whoever you might be talking to about your adaptation ideas. So I think, making that connection between the action on the ground and your broader intent is also a really great communication tool. And later on in this course, we're going to have more discussion on communication specifically, and that's going to be a big part of kind of the final week and the report out from each of your projects. And then finally, we hope that menus help boost creativity a little bit. So they might help people think a little bit outside the box or think of new adaptation ideas that they might not have considered before, or just might not have been, anywhere on the radar. I mentioned that the online workbook includes several menus. These 4 listed on the left of this slide here are ones that you'll be able to pick and choose from as you move through step 4. We also have other menus that have been fairly recently published and haven't been incorporated into the online workbook yet. And you're welcome to look at these or browse them for more ideas. These are all available on our website, forestadaptation.org. So tribal perspectives, forest carbon management, recreation, and non-forested wetlands are all menus that are included there. And there's a couple others in preparation that aren't available quite yet. I'm only going to mention this really briefly because we have a homework assignment for you related to this. But we feel like it's really helpful when thinking about adaptation and starting to pick adaptation actions to think about this range of broad adaptation options. And so the terms that we like to use are resistance, resilience, and transition. And you can kind of think of this as a spectrum of adaptation responses, all the way from resistance being, really kind of doubling down and protecting an ecosystem against climate changes or disturbance and resisting change for as long as possible, to the other end of the spectrum being intentionally helping a system to change in a way that better aligns it with future climates. So kind of facilitating more of that change and transition. And you'll hear more about this in the video assignment that we have for you this week. And that's just a reminder for me to let you know about the video assignment. We've got a video that dives into each of these concepts a little bit more, including examples of each of these adaptation options. And it's only 27 minutes long, so you can fit that in whenever it's convenient for you. The URL for that is included in the Getting Started guide for this course. And we'll also send that out via email. So ultimately, where we're trying to go with all of this is really being able to connect the dots and tell a story all the way from, what are you trying to accomplish on the landscape with your goals and objectives? How might climate change challenge that? And then what are we doing to respond? And so connecting the dots is also going to make that communication aspect a lot easier in terms of letting people know why you're doing what you're doing on the landscape. And this is really just a reminder that adaptation actions don't always look like something shiny, new, and fancy and different. Often adaptation actions can be really parallel to things that we're already doing that are responsible or smart management on the landscape. And so, out of a lot of the projects that we've worked with over the years, this is a very non-scientific breakdown of how a lot of the adaptation actions shake out. Many of those actions are similar to what people are already doing on the landscape. There's this big chunk that usually involves small tweaks or changes to actions that people are already doing. And then there are some kind of cool new ideas that are very different and take a little bit of a departure from more traditional management practices. And so, whatever you come up with for your particular project, that's legitimate. We're not expecting this to look like something completely different from directions that you've been going with your management already. So I'm going to run quickly through a couple of the key questions that we're going to be asking you in step 4. And then I'll turn it over to Patricia and she'll kind of go through the online interface for this a little bit more closely so you can see what these actually look like in the workbook. But really our main question for this whole step is, what actions can you take to really enhance the ability of your project area to adapt to those climate changes that you're experiencing or anticipating, while also meeting your management goals. So it's kind of a two-part. You want to adapt to changes, but also meet your goals and objectives. Using the menu, we're going to ask you to select approaches that make sense for your particular project. And we'll ask you to develop specific tactics within those approaches. And the tactics are really where you have the ability to get specific, as I mentioned before, and really describe the what, where, how you're going to implement a certain approach. So the more detail you can get in that tactic, the better. We'll also ask you about the time frame. So when do you want to actually implement that action on the landscape? And we'll ask you a question about what are some of the benefits of this tactic? So what are some of the reasons you might select it in your final plan? Is it cheap? Is it easy? Does it have a high likelihood of success? Are there multiple co-benefits? Things that would encourage you to select that tactic. That will also give you a chance to comment on drawbacks and barriers. So, maybe something sounds like a really good idea, but it might be really costly, or you're not sure if it'll be successful, or it's risky for other reasons. So there's also an opportunity to comment on that for each of your tactics. And so what we're really trying to do here is not get you to limit yourself right at the beginning to tactics that you only think will be the cheapest and easiest. We'd really like you to, be expansive in your initial view of adaptation tactics and select all of them that you think might make sense and wait to rule them out until you've really considered things like benefits and drawbacks. After outlining benefits and drawbacks, you'll have a chance to comment on how practical the tactic is. So is it effective and feasible? Then, it probably has high practicability. And then finally, after going through all of that, we'll give you a chance to either recommend the tactic or set it aside for now. And so even for those tactics that you don't recommend, we think it's important to kind of document your thought process behind, initially considering them and then ruling them out. So it might be something that someone wants to revisit at a future time, and they might want to know your thought process on why you didn't implement that tactic to start with. So we think the documentation is a really important component of this whole adaptation workbook. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions before turning it over to Patricia for a look through the online workbook. Okay, Patricia, I'm going to stop sharing and kick it over to you.
Okay,
Oops, as soon as my mouse starts working. There we go.
All right, a nearly seamless transition. So hi everybody. Now that we've covered step 4, let's get oriented to the online workbook. And before we do that, I just want to take a minute to say that I know that some of you are still working hard to complete step number 3, and that's okay. So you should be able to knock out both of these steps together, steps 3 and 4, once you log in. So that could be a good strategy to catch up before we pile on more material next week. So for step 4, to get started, you will click on your use workbook and log in with your account like you normally do. And then just remember that our best friend in the adaptation workbook is this handy navigation menu on the left. So today we'll click on step 4. And when you get into the homework, you'll see a landing page for that course material, just like we do every week. Except this week we won't have a ton of new stuff. And this is because you'll be relying more on your own experience in this step. So you can use the arrow to collapse that panel. And then the other panel on the top explains step 4 in case you forget how that works. And then there's also a button called the Adaptation Action Resources, which is a pop-up window with additional links to other resources. And you can collapse that window as well, or you can click on it and here's that pop-up window that comes up. So you'll see things like the Forest Adaptation Resources document, the menus of strategies and approaches, and the Climate Change Tree Atlas, as well as some more local resources that will appear depending on where you dropped your pin on that map in the beginning. So we can close out of this and minimize that panel using the little X. And then that will take us to our first decision point in step 4, which is choosing which menu of strategies and approaches you want to start with. Here we've selected the menu for forested watersheds. And so clicking on one of the options on this top bar will take you to a new window for that menu, or you can visit our web page for other menus not on the adaptation workbook, and those include menus such as the recreation menu, the wildlife menu, and the carbon management menu. So let's just, for example's sake, click on forested watersheds. And so each menu will take you to a page that lists the summary bullets for each of the strategies and each of the approaches. And then clicking on one of these strategies or approaches will take you to a section that describes in more detail a narrative about that action so that you can be sure of the intent behind it and you can be more equipped to develop a specific tactic from it. So you can just get some ideas about, you know, what exactly we're trying to do here, and then even see some example tactics of how other people have implemented that more specific approach. But then before we select our tactics, we have an opportunity to go back and review our goals and objectives. And to do that, we just click on the arrows to expand, and you'll see your forest types and management goals carried over for you from step 1. So here we see 4 different goals. We see transition hardwood, we see invasive species, young forest bird habitat, and sensitive natural communities. And if we click on that first one, transition hardwood, the box expands to show the goal in detail and the 2 objectives that we entered in step number 1. Then beneath the goals and objectives, you should see a box to add a tactic. So if you go ahead and click on that, a box pops up asking for all of your details about that tactic. And so for the first box, we have a pull-down menu to select the strategy. And you can choose from any of the 4 menus that we've included in the online workbook. And so this first one that is appearing is for the forest menu, but if you scroll down, you would see all the strategies for the agriculture workbook and the forested watersheds. And although I don't know if any of you are working in it, the agriculture menu as well. So you can select from any of those strategies. And then once you do that, the approach pull-down menu shows only those approaches for that strategy that you selected. And so you can narrow it down that way, and then you can select from any of those more specific approaches. And then when you're done with that, you can add additional strategies and approaches by clicking on this button. But keep in mind that you would only do that if your tactic would be the same for both of the strategies and approaches. And so if you would have tactics that are for different intents and different purposes, you would want to create separate tactics for each of those so that you can continue to link them up to the strategies and approaches. Then next, you would describe the specific action you would take, and again, include those details on what, when, how, and where you would implement that tactic. Get specific as possible. Pretend that, you know, you're directing one of your forest staff or stewardship volunteers to go and implement these actions, and they need to know all of these details. So get as specific as you can at this point. And then you will also record your time frame. And so this is an open-ended box. You can type in whatever makes sense for your project. And then here is where you will record the benefits and then also the drawbacks and barriers for implementation. And we're almost done, but before we click out of this box, we will also select our practicability for the tactic. And then we click save. And then the next screen allows you to select which objectives your tactic will apply to. So again, your objectives are carried over for you, and you simply click yes if applicable. Then you can add another related tactic following the same steps. And then after all of your tactics have been added, we can see here, you will be taken to a page that asks you to recommend tactics. So remember, in the last step, you identified the benefits, the drawbacks and barriers, and you rated the practicability. So here you simply combine all of that information and decide which tactics are most practicable for immediate adoption in your management plan. And it's okay not to select them all, but you will still have them in your notes as possible adaptation actions if conditions or circumstances change in the future. And it's also a good way to show your colleagues that you did consider specific actions, but then ruled them out for, you know, your own reasons. So select the ones you truly think you can implement now, leave the rest behind, and then you can click next. And then here we get another turtle moment, an opportunity to really slow down and consider your set of adaptation actions. You can ask yourself, have they really addressed your biggest concerns? Do they really work well together? So if you're comfortable, you can proceed to step 5. But if you're feeling like there may be some gaps in your plan or some barriers you need to overcome, before moving forward with the majority of these, you may want to spend a little more time on this step before moving onward. Reach out to your instructors and consult with your colleagues to identify some possible workarounds, and that might help you get over some hurdles. And then once you do feel comfortable and you're ready to move on, hit that move on button. And then if you need some inspiration, remember that we have a number of online case studies that show what adaptation actions have been selected by other landowners. You can sort these by state, you can sort them by landowner type, or you can sort them by focus area, so forests or forested watersheds, to hone in on your interests. And I know that some of you may be working outside this geography, but if you look by focus area, you may still find some inspiration in those topics. So give it a whirl. And that is basically how to navigate step number 4. So that brings us to the end of our tutorial and to a reminder of what to accomplish before next class. So first, if you haven't done so, complete step 3, and then enjoy our 27-minute YouTube video on adaptation concepts before beginning your step 4. I think it'll help a lot. And you may want to set aside 3 to 4 hours for this step. Since this is a more involved step, it's really going to get your creative juices flowing. So make sure you set enough time aside to really focus on that. And then please don't forget to do your homework after step 4. So if you need links to any of these materials that we covered, remember to check out your Getting Started guide. And then our next class will be next week on the 25th, Tuesday. We will introduce the 5th step already. Congratulations, guys. You are so close to the end. And then during our discussion activity, it would be great if you could describe a few of your adaptation approaches and actions. So maybe choose a couple that you're most excited about, or a couple that are just no-brainers, win-win. You're going to implement them because they're cheap and easy and address some climate change impacts. So just figure out what might be some really good examples for your projects and have those in your back pocket. So with that, I will check in with Kristen to see if we need to cover anything else. And I'm sure we have time for lots of questions.
We do. We are amazingly done in about half an hour, which I know we keep telling people is our goal. So it actually happened this week. But yeah, we've got some time for questions if anyone has any, or if anyone's, running into issues with the workbook that they want to talk about. We'll have a little bit more time to address some specifics in discussion as well. But if there's anything you guys think would be a benefit to the group to hear about, we've got some time for that.
Otherwise,
hang out for a few more minutes on here in case folks have questions, and Otherwise, we'll see the Tuesday discussion folks in about half an hour, and the Wednesday folks tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in.